Think back to a time where someone's insensitivity ever hurt you. It could be something simple like tripping over your shoelace in the hallway and someone laughing at you, or confiding in someone with something that you thought you could trust them with and their response not being what you had hoped. The reason for that response that they gave you was probably because they didn't have the tools to respond in the proper way, such as empathy. That is why it's important to address our own suffering, because a lack of addressing that leads to unawareness. So, allowing ourselves to lament creates an honesty before God that deepens our relationship with Him and develops greater empathy towards other people. As far as my credibility is concerned, I've researched many Christian scholars, including John Hubbard, Elizabeth Hall, and the Christian Reformed Church. And for goodwill, everyone can relate to this. Everyone has experienced grief or suffering in some form, and it's beneficial to everybody to learn how to engage with suffering in a healthy way. So, the goal of this speech is to help everyone know how engaging in your lament can actually transfer to empathizing better with other people. And I'll do that in 3 ways. Point 1, avoiding lament can stunt your spiritual growth. 2, lament is actually an act of faith, rather a lack of it, or instead of a lack of it. And 3, practicing lament develops compassion and empathy towards others. That's what will tie this in a bow. So, first point, the lack of honesty with ourselves and God leads to stunted spiritual growth. John Hubbard explains in If You Confess that there are 2 common responses for a Christian. One is avoiding confession completely, and one is the repeat confessor that doesn't actually accept forgiveness. And that is a rabbit trail I could go down, but I will not today. Elizabeth Hall explains that lament allows believers to bring suffering into conversation with God rather than suppressing it. And I think that's a really important idea in this idea of why it's actually beneficial to engage in your suffering. So kind of to transition, instead of weakening the faith, that honest lament that I'm talking about actually demonstrates trust in God. So my point 2 is faithful honesty shows that expressing grief is not a lack of faith, but rather an act of faith. A good example of this, Hall points out, is Jesus praying to God in the Garden of Gethsemane. He brings his suffering to God honestly and directly. And a point that Hall states when he's bringing this up is that lament assumes that God listens and cares and is present even in suffering. And I think that that's a beautiful way to put it. So as believers, learning to honestly process our own suffering before God, we become compassionate towards the pain of others, leading to my 3rd point. Practicing lament helps develop compassion by helping believers recognize suffering in others and responding with deeper empathy and love towards those people. The Christian Reformed Church, an article called "The Benefit of Lament on the Heart," explains that that lament awakens compassion because it helps us recognize our own grief, and therefore helps us become less dismissive of other people's pain. Another point with that is that lament teaches believers not to rush towards finding a solution for someone else's pain, as many of us often do, and instead it develops humility and peace and emotional awareness for that pain of other people by teaching us to simply sit in suffering with others rather than just ignoring it and moving on to how do I fix this. So, in conclusion, lament is far more than simply expressing sadness. To reiterate my thesis, avoiding lament can stunt spiritual growth and harden our hearts, while honest lament deepens your faith, strengthens your relationship with God, and develops compassion for other people. This is why it is so important to have grace and patience for others in times of trouble. Just like the insensitivity of a person that we talked about at the beginning of this, how that can hurt other people. Thank you.